Assalamu alaikum and welcome. Throughout these series we've been talking about justice and injustice in particular, how we can recognise injustice in our lives, in the lives of others around us and in our societies, and how we might be able to move forward and address those issues. Today it seems appropriate to talk about not just the injustices that happen to us as human beings, but also the injustices that we do to our environment and to those creations that are not human, so in particular animals. The rights and welfare of animals, the rights and welfare of our environment, of the nature around us. Sometimes in the context of social conflict, of deprivation, of poverty, of all sorts of different issues that we may be facing, the idea that we need to focus on the environment or animals in particular is often derided. You know, where on the scale of importance are we talking about if children are being damaged and abused, and then, you know, people feel that then talking about the rights of animals, for example, is somehow derisory or takes away from the other important issues. But I would argue that looking after our environment, taking care of the things around us, the creatures around us, whether it's wild animals or domesticated animals or work animals, is obviously not only for our own benefit, but for the benefit and duty that we have as the Khalifat on earth. You know, this is part of our amana, this is part of our duty, our custodianship, to make sure that we don't damage and exploit, but that we support, that we nurture, and that we protect those things that cannot protect themselves. And that includes the natural world. And of course, there are very strong Islamic motivations and duties and a framework around why we should be caring about our environment, why we should be custodians rather than exploiters of the animals and the nature around us. And I'm reminded of the verse in the Quran, 142 of chapter 9, and I'm of course reminded of chapter 6 verse 142 of the Quran, which talks about the bounties around us, but that we're not to be profligate with them, we're to be moderate. We are to make sure that we treat the environment with respect as well as gaining the benefits. And again, it's about that balance that brings justice, that we benefit from things, but we also bring benefit ourselves, that we enjoy those blessings, the resources, the foods, the minerals, the animals around us. You know, we're permitted to eat the flesh of animals, of those that are halal, but again, we're not meant to be plundering. We're meant to do this with respect. We're meant to do with this love and thankfulness that we have this world of bounty around us, and that also for those of us who have and are able to access these bounties, while there are others who cannot, that we again redress this balance. So at the moment, the world is in a state of great imbalance. Those who are able to access resources, particularly the resources of the earth, whether that's mining for precious minerals that go into our electronic goods, whether it's mining for gold that go into our jewellery, whether it's mining for other precious things, or for example food crops which are grown on a mass scale and that a small number of the world's population consumes in comparison to the many people who struggle on a daily basis for basic food, for basic goods, for basic necessities, when the rest of us are taking more than we are owed, taking more than is sustainable, and indeed wasting a lot of it. And I just used the word owed, and again, it's something to question. Are we really owed these things, or rather should we be seeing it as a gift? Or should we be seeing it as something which is a privilege and that we should be sharing around, and that we should think about before we do this? There's a big debate as well around global warming, with some people, particularly those who have a stake in the economic advantages brought by burning fossil fuels, burning oil, who don't like to address the fact that there do appear to be many issues and many forms of destruction that we are wrecking upon the earth. Not only around global warming, but about the kind of messes that we're making with litter, with rubbish, with the things we throw away, the lack of recycling, and when we do recycle, the byproducts that we seem to make. So a whole range of exploitative practices which are not only creating damage now, but are creating damage for the future. And if we are custodians now, our future generations will be asking, you know, what did they do about it? Why are we in a situation that we are now? So it's not just for us and our welfare now in the present, but for the future generations. And an important concept from the Islamic perspective is this idea of moderating and sharing out and making sure that we have a level of sustainability and custodianship over all of these things. And this is not just in peace times or when we're in a situation where we are able to do this. This is also in wartime. So Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, radiallahu anh, he is very famous for talking about the armies and their duties of care. Now, normally we think about armies and you know, as men and women who are fighting, who are involved in battles, but also within that remit that of course they have, Abu Bakr was very strong in reinforcing the message of the Prophet ﷺ that those armies should never harm the environment around them, as well as protecting the innocent people, to protect the trees, to protect animals, to protect the livelihoods and livestock of the areas through which they passed. So there have been these traditions of any soldiers to plunder, to take, to treat those things that they pass through or those places that they pass through as something entitled to them, that they could plunder or set on fire or take or ruin. But absolutely, from the Islamic perspective, this was inverted on its head. War was not about plundering and taking. It was about, yes, military action, but also with that sustainable, careful approach in which things were being protected, not attacked, looked after and not plundered. This sense of rights and entitlement, as opposed to understanding where we are and the scale of things, is often out of kilter. And actually, this is something where I think the Muslims have something to contribute very strongly to the world conversation. When we talk about buzzwords, particularly within the West, about sustainability, about you know, the welfare of the environment and of animals, it's often in the position of people of power. But without that consciousness of Godhood, that Allah is ultimately the owner of the universe, the creator of the universe, and that we are merely visitors, we are passing through, we are lent these things. These are our privileges that are given to us but are not permanent. So when we think about ownership, ownership from the Islamic perspective is not something that it's all about we have something and we can abuse it as we like because it is ours. No, this is about we are being lent it, we are being given it to look after, and we must bring benefit to things, not as we use them, rather than that sort of very destructive. We're being lent these things rather than owning them to be destructive and having willpower over it. So this concept that we find within the Islamic framework of being not the owners but the trustees of the environment, not only presents ourselves as you know, not being in complete power, to remember the power of Allah over ourselves, but it also gives us a degree of responsibility and an authority which should be used to dignify ourselves and others. And that sense of dignity is felt very strongly within many of our Quranic ayah. So, for example, in the Quran, the chapter 33, verse 72, talks about the way in which mankind has taken on the responsibility, and that is a privilege and something very beautiful, and imparts a duty of care that is not about this sort of animalistic, desire-led interaction that we often see around us. So the economic system that we exist in, where goods are permanently made to be consumed and thrown away without care, the idea that we gain money and collect it and spend in ways that aren't beneficial for our communities but which beautify the individual, these are all parts of this problem and relate to the way that we have found ourselves in a situation where forests are being cut down and burned, where the oil pulled from under the ground and pulled from under the water even is creating all sorts of disasters in terms of chemical spillages, of oil spillages, and impacting gravely on animals and the environment. So I've been talking about this dynamic of responsibility and of the global scale, the kind of problems that we are creating for ourselves on a grand environmental global situation. And that's often very difficult to try and get to grips with as individuals, because this is in part to do with the way that governments operate and is even beyond our ability to change. So in the UK, for example, households have been encouraged very strongly to do recycling. But very recently we found out that a lot of the things that we've been putting aside and imagined and were told were going to be recycled were in fact being dumped overseas, in Indonesia, in China and in parts of Africa. So that our attempt at recycling as individuals has been essentially been deceived, and that the impact is happening in countries that are being paid because many times the population requires the economic benefit that comes to, but again at the sacrifice of those countries' environments, of those people's welfare, of the water table in those places becoming polluted by the goods that we thought were going to be recycled and were going to be environmentally friendly. So sometimes this can make us very cynical, you know, there's nothing we can do. Even when we try, it has the opposite effect. And what are we going to do when it's about global politics, global economics, and a lack of willpower from those in power, because the benefits that they gain from things that are environmentally unfriendly get there. So please join me after the break and I'll talk about the things that on a local level, on an individual level, that we see around us and that we can do something about. So thank you and Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. Before the break I was discussing the importance of the environment and our duty of care towards everything in it, not only human beings but the animals and the plants, the birds, that not only beautify our environment, but that actually, if we look even from a very selfish point of view, help sustain our own lives. Without the forests, there will be not enough processing of the carbon dioxide and the oxygen systems. Without the animals to provide different habitats, the biodiversity that we rely upon for a healthy and sustained environment, we're going to be in great trouble as human beings. So not only is this about the duty of care that we have, or the beauty of the environment. And remember that beauty, scientists have very recently discovered that actually seeing beauty can affect our psychological development as children, but also our continuing psychological and emotional welfare is benefited by seeing green trees and green grass and green environments. So beautiful places, the sea, beautiful air. These are not only of aesthetic quality, but they are physical and emotional benefit to us. So there's a whole range of benefits as well as reasons why this is important. But as I was saying, the conversations often seem too big for us as individuals to get a grip on and to make changes. If governments don't have the willpower to change things, if it's all about international politics and economics, then what can we do? But actually there are some of these issues just in our localities, even in our families. From an environmental perspective, there are small things we can do, whether it's gardening and making our own areas biodiverse by planting and nurturing and caring. But there's also some negative situations that we find. Litter, for example, we see so many examples of dumping of rubbish, of careless throwing of rubbish into our streets, into our natural areas that were once very beautiful and full of wildlife and a healthy environment, are now seriously polluted. Polluted by us as individuals. It's us that are throwing cans out of the window or dumping the rubbish that smells in our house outside because we don't want it near us, and we're aware of the dangers of it within our families. But we also feel that it's okay to stick outside in the world and the environment that we feel is not part of our duty of care. And of course there are some issues, the lack of infrastructure that governments need to provide to help us take away our litter, for example. But if we're a little bit more careful about these situations and have the courage to stand up to others who are doing this, that's also important. I have a dear friend, for example, who, much braver than I, will go up to strangers and berate them for dropping litter or being careless in that way. And while that could be a potentially difficult and potentially dangerous activity, it's not difficult amongst our own family, it's not difficult amongst our own communities to say, look, this isn't right. And when it has happened, there are great examples of community organising to clear up places. So communal litter picking, not a particularly enjoyable idea, but actually when people gather together in a park that's been littered and come together, pick the litter up together and celebrate the newly beautified area, this is something that's not difficult to do and can make real profound changes to our local environment, but also teaches our younger generations the importance of looking after and maintaining the world around us, not only for the fact that it's so much nicer to be in an environment, but because it is about the health and welfare of the world and of ourselves. And then I'd like to again go back to this idea of looking after the animals. I'll talk about food and welfare of the production of meat at another time, but this often extends to the way that we treat the animals in our care or in our localities. And what's quite disturbing is, particularly in urban areas, but also rural areas, the use of animals, particularly dogs, in sport. And in the UK, for example, youth in urban areas, many of them, Muslim youth, continue and in fact is increasing to breed animals and breed dogs who are specifically intended to use in fights, to be aggressive. So there's a macho element to own dogs that are frightening to other people, who are slightly wild and inclined towards attacking, but also the use of dogs within fighting sports. So the use of dogs in sport, for example, dogs in fighting sports, is not only haram in the state of using animals for pleasure, to fight to the death, to injure each other and sometimes to injure humans. We also see that connected to other forms of negative and haram behaviour, including gambling, including the kind of broader fighting and conflict and aggression and criminality that comes with that whole environment. So a complete disregard for the welfare of the animals, but also a complete disregard for the broader environment and the kind of impact that has on the people involved and the communities that have to witness this kind of behaviour. And the preponderance of this is often linked to this lack of understanding that animals are creatures with emotion and with pain, and that we are we are expected from a religious perspective and an ethical perspective to desist from this kind of behaviour. Similarly, you often hear jokes about the way that the Western Europeans are more interested in the welfare of their pets than they are about the welfare of children in the global South or elsewhere. And to an extent, this sort of cynicism is born out of a level of truth, and there is a blind eye turned towards the suffering of human beings. But again, it's important not to conflate the issues, and it's important not to negate the fact that we should be looking after animals in a much more proactive way in our communities and in our societies. The use of working animals, for example, treated in the same sort of way that slaves were in the past, just as physical bodies who are expected to do work, who are used in ways that are obviously physically damaging to them, but aren't sustainable and sort of thrown away, thrown to the side when they're done. The problem with that is not only the pain and suffering it brings to that creature, but it isn't sustainable for the humans that do these things. From a very selfish perspective, again, if you abuse an animal in this way, it isn't going to last very long. So there are a whole host of reasons why we need to be thinking about how we treat creatures, how we treat the living things around us. Plants as well. It's not about necessarily cruelty in relation to plants, but it's about the beautification of the landscape and the benefits that those diverse creations bring to us. So what I hope I've done over this particular episode is sketch out this sense of Islamic duty and ethical duty we have towards our broader environment, but also the local familial environment around us, that we have the duty to campaign for the big issues, but we also have the power to change the small issues, the way that we interact with our environment, the way that we care about the things around us. And that's what can be empowering, and we can educate our youth in particular about the dangers of polluting the places around us, and in fact around other people, so that it becomes a communal responsibility, not in a selfish local way, but to see the networks and broader effects that we have that span out to a global scale, so that my acts here in the UK will inevitably impact negatively or positively on people all the way over in China or Indonesia or in South America. So we have the connections and the impact to do that, but we also have the impetus and power to change things very well. And absolutely education around this issue, talking about it and seeing it as important and having a stake. Yes, we can care about the political oppression of nations. Yes, we can care about the situation of poverty and of abuse and other forms of victimization. But we also need to take responsibility and take a stake. I heard someone talking recently about whether he thought that Muslims were integrated into Western society, and he obviously felt that we weren't fully. And one of the reasons he gave was that we don't join societies and charities that give to, for example, birds and the welfare of birds and animals. And on the one hand, obviously, this is an opinion that is both slightly insulting, well, extremely insulting about the nature of belonging and integration. But his underlying point about whether we feel that we have a stake in our societies, whether we actually belong enough to care about the environment, the local birds, or a local forest, or whether another road is being built. If we care about those things, do we actually belong? But the wider question is, the mentality can shift so that we understand that we belong to the world as a whole, and that the environment is connected as a whole. So it's not just about integration and belonging in a particular country, but integration and belonging as the Khilafah on earth, you know, as we are you know, dutiful Muslims, and Muslims that care about what we do and how we do it, and the impact that we have not only on ourselves but on other people and other creatures around us. So I hope that's been interesting, and that you'll join me next time, inshallah. Thank you very much for listening, and Assalamu alaikum.